Welcome back to the Deep Dive. For centuries, philosophers, and really anyone who thinks deeply, have wrestled with this incredibly stubborn mystery. How does our inner world, the feeling of a memory, the taste of an orange, connect to the outer world of physical stuff?
Right, the classic mind-body problem. It's arguably the fundamental question, and it set the stage for some major philosophical battles.
Yeah, and historically, you've got the big two contenders, right? Dualism, mind, and matter are totally separate things.
Exactly. And then materialism, which says, nope, mind is just physical stuff, complex brain activity, basically.
And this is the key thing, both of these traditional views seem to hit these huge roadblocks.
Yeah.
Problems they just can't seem to solve convincingly.
Absolutely. They face seemingly insurmountable challenges. And that's where the search begins for, a third way. And increasingly, that third way people are turning to is panpsychism.
Panpsychism, the idea that consciousness isn't some weird fluke that popped up late in evolution.
But that it's fundamental, everywhere, part of the basic furniture of the universe. The hope is it can patch the holes left by dualism and materialism by saying, look, matter itself has a conscious nature at some level.
It definitely sounds promising. A potential grand solution. Here's what we're going to do in this deep dive. We're going to explore some really serious problems that panpsychism runs into, specifically when it holds on to one particular, often unspoken assumption about reality.
A kind of hidden assumption.
Exactly. We'll show how, if it keeps this assumption, panpsychism kind of ends up creating problems that look suspiciously like the very ones it was trying to fix. It's all about this crucial split between what's called realist and anti-realist panpsychism. That's where we're focusing.
Yeah, some philosophers call this hidden assumption the worm in the panpsychist apple. It's a great image. We need to figure out what this worm is, why it causes so much trouble, and whether panpsychism can only really work if it takes a much more, radical stance on reality.
Okay, so let's set the stage properly. To really get why panpsychism is appealing, and also why it gets tricky, we need to first appreciate the problems its rivals face, the reasons people started looking elsewhere.
Let's start with dualism. It's very intuitive, right? Our inner life feels different from our physical body, and dualists really want our thoughts, our desires, to actually do things in the physical world.
Of course. That feels fundamental to being human. If I decide I want an apple, that decision, that mental thing, causes my hand to reach out and grab it. Agency.
That's the intuition, definitely. But here's the clash. Modern science operates on this bedrock principle called causal closure. Basically the idea that any physical event has a sufficient physical cause.
Okay, let's unpack the weight of that. So if I reach for the apple, causal closure says the movement of my arm, the muscle contractions, all that physical stuff.
Yeah.
It's fully explained by prior physical events, like neurons firing in my brain.
Precisely. The neurophysiology is seen as a complete cause for the physical action. And if that's the case, where does the non-physical dualist mind, the desire, fit in? It can't add any extra physical push without violating closure.
So it gets squeezed out?
Exactly. It becomes epiphenomenal. Like the steam whistle on a train, it happens alongside the engine's work, but it doesn't actually pull the train. The mental state becomes a side effect with no real causal power over the physical world.
Wow, yeah. Consciousness is just a powerless spectator.
And for most philosophers, that's just not acceptable. It undermines our whole sense of free will, agency, even why consciousness would evolve in the first place if it literally does nothing. This causal exclusion problem is a killer for dualism. How does a non-physical mind push physical stuff around?
Okay, so dualism stumbles badly on causation. Materialism comes along and says, easy, the mind is the brain state. So the desire is a physical thing and it can cause the action. Problem solved.
Well, it solves causal exclusion, yes. But it walks right into a different, arguably deeper problem, the explanatory gap, also known as the hard problem of consciousness.
Ah, right. Materialism is great at how the mechanics, the neurons firing, the chemicals.
It can map the whole physical process beautifully, but the gap is about the experience itself, the subjective first-person feeling.
The idea being, even if we knew everything physical about the brain state, when someone tastes an apple, every atom, every electrical pulse.
You could have the complete third-person objective scientific story.
And still, you wouldn't know what it's like to taste that apple, the actual subjective quality, the appliness.
Correct. There's nothing in the purely physical description, no matter how detailed, that seems to logically necessitate or explain the emergence of that inner qualitative feeling. Why that specific electrochemical dance feels like sweetness rather than, say, bitterness, or rather than feeling like nothing at all, there's a gap in the explanation.
So dualism fails on doing Materialism fails on feeling, roughly speaking.
That's a good way to put it. Dualism struggles with causation, the mind doing things. Materialism struggles with explanation, the nature of subjective feeling. And this is the opening panpsychism tries to exploit. It offers a way, supposedly, to solve both problems at once.
And it does this using an argument linked to Bertrand Russell about the limits of physics.
Exactly. The Russellian monism argument, or the intrinsic nature argument. Russell pointed out something really interesting about physics. It tells us what matter does, its behavior, its relationships with other bits of matter.
Like how an electron repels another electron, or how mass warps space-time. It describes the structure, the mathematical relationships.
Right. Physics gives us the relational properties, the abstract mathematical structure of reality, but it remains completely silent about what matter is, intrinsically in itself. What's the actual stuff that has these relationships or behaves according to these equations?
So physics describes the rules of the game, but not what the game pieces are actually made of, their inner nature.
That's a great analogy. Physics gives us the abstract structure, but it doesn't specify the underlying categorical nature that realizes or implements that structure. There's this inherent limitation.
And panpsychism jumps in here.
Yes. The panpsychist proposal is this: that missing intrinsic nature of matter is consciousness. What we observe from the outside as physical structures and behaviors like neurons firing is just the external appearance of systems that are, on the inside, subjects having experiences.
Okay, hold on. That's a big leap. Why does the missing intrinsic stuff have to be consciousness? Couldn't it be some other kind of unknown, non-conscious fundamental property? Why specifically consciousness?
That's the crucial question, and the standard panpsychist reply goes something like this. We are looking for the intrinsic, non-relational nature of matter. What intrinsic, non-relational nature do we actually know exists for certain?
Our own consciousness. My own direct experience is pretty intrinsic and non-relational in that sense.
Exactly. Consciousness is the only intrinsic nature we have direct first-person acquaintance with. We know from the inside that subjective experience is a real categorical feature of the world. So the argument goes, rather than positing some completely unknown, mysterious, non-conscious intrinsic stuff, let's call it property X, why not identify the intrinsic nature of matter with the one intrinsic nature we actually know exists, consciousness? It's arguably more parsimonious.
Okay, I see the logic. It avoids inventing a totally new mystery. So if we accept this premise, consciousness is the intrinsic nature of matter, how does that solve the original problems?
Well, the hard problem seems to dissolve. Consciousness doesn't mysteriously emerge from complex non-conscious matter because matter was already conscious at a fundamental level. There's no jump from non-feeling to feeling. Feeling was there all along, just perhaps in very simple forms.
Makes sense. And causal exclusion.
That's also addressed, or at least significantly changed. Conscious states are no longer dualistic ghosts trying to influence physical machinery from the outside. Instead, they are the intrinsic reality of the physical machinery. The physical behaviors described by physics equations are the external manifestations of what these conscious states are intrinsically doing. They're not epiphenomenal. They're the very things implementing the causal relations physics describes.
So consciousness gets its causal power back because it is the stuff that's doing the causing, just viewed from the inside.
Precisely. It seems to offer this elegant synthesis, solving both the explanatory gap and the causal exclusion problem. It looks like a really powerful solution.
It really does. On the surface, it feels like it threads the needle perfectly. But we know there's a catch. This is where the worm comes in.
Right.
This is where things get really, really critical. The sources we looked at suggest that panpsychism's success or failure hangs almost entirely on one deep, often unstated metaphysical assumption it tends to inherit.
An assumption about the nature of physical reality itself.
Exactly. And this assumption is the worm in the panpsychist apple. It's the common sense, almost automatic belief that the physical world, space, time, objects exists out there, objectively, independently of any mind observing it.
The idea of an outer observer-independent reality, it seems so obvious, right? We inherit this view from both dualism and materialism. The world is just there.
Yeah, it feels like the default setting. Why would accepting this perfectly normal idea cause problems for panpsychism? If matter is conscious and it exists externally, what's the big deal?
The big deal is that trying to hold both ideas simultaneously, that reality is fundamentally experiential and exists in observer-independent space, creates massive conceptual problems. It leads to a fundamental split within panpsychism itself.
Okay, so what are the two camps?
On one side, you have realist panpsychism. This is the view that tries to keep that observer-independent world. It says, yes, the physical world is really out there, external, spatial, structured, just like we think. But its fundamental constituents, its intrinsic nature, are conscious subjects or experiences.
So the atoms making up this table are out there in mind-independent space, and they are tiny subjects having tiny experiences.
That's the core idea of realist panpsychism, and according to the analysis we're exploring, this commitment to realism is precisely what leads to disaster. It runs into two major, potentially fatal problems we need to unpack.
And the other side?
The other side is anti-realist panpsychism. This view bites the bullet and says, no, we have to abandon the idea of an observer-independent physical world. Physical structures, space, time, objects, they aren't fundamentally out there in some container existing apart from minds.
Whoa. Okay, so if they aren't out there, where are they?
For the anti-realist, physical structures are grounded most immediately in consciousness itself, specifically in the conscious field of the observer. The table isn't a mind-independent thing that you then perceive. The table is the structured pattern of conscious experience, the percept that arises in your awareness, likely elicited by other underlying conscious entities.
That sounds radical, almost like idealism.
It definitely overlaps significantly with forms of idealism, yes. It's a huge departure from our default thinking. But their argument is that this radical move is the only way for panpsychism to avoid the crippling problems caused by realism. It's presented as the necessary cost of a coherent panpsychist theory.
Okay, this is fascinating. Let's dedicate the next part to really understanding why the realist version supposedly fails so badly.
Yeah.
What are these two devastating problems? Let's start with the first one, the combination problem.
Right, the combination problem. This is probably the most famous challenge to panpsychism, it asks. If fundamental reality is made of lots of tiny, simple, conscious subjects, microsubjects, how do these little points of view combine or merge together to form the single, unified, complex consciousness of a human being or an animal, a macrosubject?
How do you get my single viewpoint from zillions of tiny neuron viewpoints, for instance?
Exactly. And to see why this is so hard, we have to constantly remember the defining feature of any conscious subject. It's utter privacy.
That idea that my experience is sealed off. You can know about my experience, but you can't have my experience.
Precisely. It's fundamental. William James famously said the boundaries between individual minds are the most absolute breaches and breaks in nature. Your consciousness is yours, mine is mine. The perspectives are inherently separate. You can't literally pour the contents of my conscious field into yours.
Okay, privacy is key. Now, how does that crash into micropsychism, the idea that my consciousness is built up from microconsciousnesses, like particles or cells?
Well, think about it. If my unified consciousness is supposed to be constituted by the experiences of, say, millions of individual neurons, each having its own tiny private experience, how does that happen? For them to form a unified field, it seems their individual boundaries have to be breached. Their private experiences have to somehow spill over or merge into a larger container, my mind.
But doesn't that destroy the very privacy that defines them as subjects in the first place? If the neuron's experience spills into mine, is it still the neuron's private experience?
That's the heart of the problem. Combination seems to require violating the fundamental privacy that makes something a conscious subject. It's like trying to add viewpoints together, how to use some perspectives without destroying them.
And the sources mentioned, we often fall into a trap here, visualizing it wrong.
Yes, exactly. We tend to implicitly picture it spatially, like we have little conscious bubbles, the microsubjects, floating in space, and they somehow physically merge like water droplets to form a bigger bubble, the macrosubject.
Because we're thinking of the neurons or particles as physical things combining in space.
Right, but consciousness isn't a substance in space that can be combined like that. Experience is inherently perspectival. Trying to mix perspectives spatially seems conceptually incoherent. You can't just add subjective points of view together mathematically.
Okay, so building up from small consciousnesses seems impossible without violating privacy.
Yeah.
What about the other way around? Maybe start big. That's cosmopsychism, right?
Yeah.
The idea that the whole universe is one big conscious subject.
Yes. Cosmopsychism tries to avoid the combination problem by saying, look, there's only one fundamental subject, the cosmos itself. Our individual consciousnesses aren't built up. They are somehow derived from the cosmic consciousness.
So we're like facets or subdivisions of the universal mind.
Something like that. But this just flips the problem on its head. Now, instead of the combination problem, you face the decombination problem.
Decombination.
Yeah. If the cosmos has one unified, all-encompassing experience, how does it somehow fragment or differentiate itself to produce our distinct, limited, private, conscious perspectives? How do you get these separate bubbles of awareness out of the single unified cosmic field?
So, if the universal mind experiences everything, how does my experience manage to be so limited and specific? How does it exclude almost everything the cosmic mind knows?
Precisely. The defining feature of our consciousness is its limited, focused, perspectival nature. We experience this, not that. If the cosmic mind contains all experiences simultaneously, how does it generate the boundaries, the exclusions, necessary for individual subjects like us to exist? It seems to require the cosmic mind to somehow wall off parts of its own unified awareness.
It sounds like you either can't get the privacy barriers up, micropsychism, or you can't get them down from the top level, cosmopsychism.
That captures the dilemma really well. Different versions try different things, like suggesting the cosmic experience literally contains ours, or involves some kind of transfer of qualia. But these often seem to run into the same fundamental issues about perspective and privacy. How do you share or partition subjective points of view?
So circling back to the worm, the hidden assumption, how does realism cause these combination-decombination nightmares?
It seems to be the root cause because the realist assumption forces us to think spatially. By insisting that the fundamental entities, particles, neurons, or even the cosmos, exist in an objective, external spatial framework, we are almost inevitably led to think about their consciousness combining or dividing in ways analogous to how physical objects combine or divide in space.
We picture consciousness like stuff inside spatial containers because we assume the containers, the physical entities, fundamentally spatial and independent.
Exactly. The realist panpsychist inherits this picture of a mind-independent spatial arena. Then they try to overlay consciousness onto it, but consciousness, being private and perspectival, doesn't fit neatly into that spatial combinatorial logic. The boundaries of consciousness don't seem to behave like the boundaries of physical objects in space. So if you cling to that realist spatial picture, you get stuck in these combination paradoxes.
Okay, so the combination problem is a serious hurdle for realist panpsychism. But the sources suggest there's another problem, the inner-outer gap, that's considered just as bad, maybe even worse, because it undermines the very reason panpsychism seemed appealing in the first place.
Yes, it's argued to be every bit as devastating. This gap emerges directly from the core tension within realist panpsychism. The clash between its two central claims. One, that the fundamental reality grounding matter is inner, private, first-person subjective experience. And two, the realist commitment that the structures of matter exist externally, objectively, independently, and spatially located.
Inner subjective feelings realizing outer objective structures.
Right. And the devastating question the realist panpsychist must answer is, how? How does the inner world of private, non-spatial experience somehow necessarily give rise to or become or manifest as an outer world of observer-independent, spatially located structures and predictable physical behaviors? What's the bridge?
It sounds like magic. How does feeling become external location and structure?
Well, that's the accusation. By trying to hold on to both the inner experiential nature and the outer independent structure, realist panpsychism seems to introduce a profound mystery right at the heart of its theory. A mysterious transformation or emergence.
And this is where the symmetry argument comes in, right? That this new mystery looks suspiciously like the old ones.
Exactly. This is a crucial point. Remember, materialism had the mystery of how mind emerges from non-mental matter. Mind gap.
Yep, the hard problem.
Dualism had the mystery of how a non-physical mind interacts with physical matter. Interaction gap, causal exclusion.
Right.
Now, realist panpsychism, by insisting that inner experience realizes outer independent structures, creates its own symmetrical gap. The mystery of how outer structured matter emerges from inner mind. Mind-matter gap.
Wow. So they didn't solve the emergence mystery, they just reversed its direction. Instead of mind mysteriously popping out of matter, now matter mysteriously pops out of mind.
That's the charge. They got rid of the need for non-conscious stuff to magically generate consciousness, which is good. But by clinging to realism about the outer world, they've introduced the need for consciousness to magically generate the entire specific structure of the outer spatial, law-governed physical world. Why this specific set of physical laws and structures arises from consciousness is left completely unexplained. It's a new explanatory gap, just as deep as the old one.
It's like playing whack-a-mole with mystery. You solve one and another pops up.
Pretty much. It seems like a zero-sum game if you hold on to that realist assumption about the external world.
Let's make this concrete with the Jim and Lucy example from this source. Jim is watching Lucy.
Okay. So Jim, the observer, is looking at Lucy, the subject, who is maybe eating an apple. The realist panpsychist has to maintain two things are true simultaneously. First, the realist part. The physical stuff. Jim sees Lucy's brain activity on a scanner, her arm moving. The apple itself exists literally out there in objective, mind-independent space, inside her skull, in the room, etc.
Standard realism.
Got it. Second, the panpsychist part. These very same external spatial structures and behaviors, the neurons firing, the arm moving, are, at their fundamental level, realized by or grounded in Lucy's inner, private, first-person experiences, her desire for the apple, the subjective taste, the feeling of moving her arm.
And the gap is?
The gap is the necessary link between the two. Why must Lucy's inner, private, non-spatial feeling of, say, wanting the apple inevitably manifest as that specific pattern of publicly observable, spatially located neural firings in her objectively existing brain? How does the inner quality mandate the outer structure in observer-independent space?
There's no obvious reason why that feeling should produce that physical pattern externally.
Exactly. Explaining that connection, that transmutation from private inner experience to public outer structure and behavior without just saying it just does becomes the new hard problem for the realist panpsychist. They've created this chasm between the inner experiential ground and the outer independent manifestation. They haven't explained how mind generates matter's specific structure, leaving a transformational gap.
Okay, so if realist panpsychism gets tangled in the combination problem and this devastating inner-outer gap, it really does seem like a dead end, which points towards anti-realism as the only viable path forward for a panpsychist.
That's the conclusion this line of argument pushes towards, yes. The idea is that by making the radical move, by abandoning the assumption of an observer-independent physical world, by ditching the idea of external space as a separate container,
You avoid the problems.
you avoid the source of the problems. If there is no observer-independent external space for consciousness to somehow manifest into, then the inner-outer gap simply doesn't arise. There's no mysterious transmutation needed from inner feeling to outer structure because the outer structure isn't conceived as independent in that way.
And the combination problem.
That also dissolves, or at least changes form dramatically. If microsubjects aren't literally tiny things located next to each other in external space, then the problem of how their experiences spatially merge disappears. Combination might still be complex, but it's no longer framed in that incoherent spatial way.
Okay, but conceptually, what does this anti-realist world look like? If the table isn't out there, what am I seeing?
It's a profound shift. The anti-realist suggests that what we perceive as the physical world, the table, the room, other people, isn't a view of an independent reality. It is the reality we directly encounter. These structures are patterns within consciousness. Specifically, they are patterns of cognoscensory imagery appearing to the observer.
Cognoscensory imagery? That sounds a bit like just images in my head, like a dream or a memory. Is world just my imagination?
That's a really important clarification point. No, the anti-realist isn't saying the world is arbitrary or unreal like a dream. Cognoscensory imagery here refers to the structured, vivid, constrained nature of perception itself, the actual colors, shapes, sounds, textures you are experiencing right now.
So the immediate real feeling sensory input.
Yes. It's objective in the sense that it's not typically under your voluntary control, and it behaves in consistent, law-like ways. But its reality, its grounding, is within the field of conscious experience, not in a hypothetical realm outside of it. It's perception-based reality, not observer-independent reality.
So the table I see is a stable, predictable pattern of experience in my consciousness, elicited somehow.
Elicited, the anti-realist would say, by the underlying reality, which consists of other conscious subjects or centers of experience. These other subjects have the inherent power or disposition to affect my consciousness, causing structured patterns, like the table appearance, to arise within it.
So physical objects aren't things. They are stable appearances generated by the interactions between subjects.
In essence, yes. Subjects aren't in space. Space is a way subjects appear to each other. This avoids the gaps, but it doesn't solve everything. There's still a fundamental explanatory burden left.
Okay, what's the remaining challenge, even for the anti-realists?
Even if you successfully avoid the combination and inner-outer gaps, both realist and anti-realist panpsychism ultimately rely on a similar core idea, that experiential subjects possess the inherent disposition or power to appear to one another or affect one another's experience in structured, law-like ways.
The power to generate consistent appearances.
Right. And the huge, profound question that remains is why? What explains why all these fundamental subjects have these specific powers? Why are they disposed to appear to each other in ways that conform to what we call the laws of physics? Why this consistent isomorphic structure across all these interactions?
Why does my experience of dropping a cup consistently appear to you, if you were watching, as a cup accelerating according to gravity, hitting the floor, maybe shattering? Why that particular reliable pattern of appearances?
Exactly. What grounds the laws governing these appearances? The anti-realist can't simply point to the physical laws themselves because those laws are part of the appearance they're trying to explain. They describe the pattern of the appearances, not the ultimate reason why the underlying subjects have the dispositions to produce that pattern.
So there's still a deep mystery about the origin of the order, the lawfulness, and how consciousness manifests itself to other consciousnesses.
Yes. There must be some fundamental principle or reality that constrains the dispositional powers of all these subjects, ensuring they interact in consistent, predictable, isomorphic ways. Explaining that is the ultimate challenge that remains, even if anti-realism solves the other problems.
Okay, let's talk about science then. If anti-realism is true, and the physical world isn't observer-independent, what happens to physics? Is it just wrong?
Not wrong, but reinterpreted. Anti-realism requires a shift in how we view science. The standard scientific picture with its fundamental entities like particles, fields, space-time existing independently out there has to be seen in a sense as a highly useful fiction.
A fiction. That sounds dismissive of science's success.
Maybe fiction is too strong. Perhaps a powerful model or an instrumental framework. The point is, it's an incredibly effective way to describe and predict the patterns of our conscious experience, the regularities in the appearances. The mathematical laws of physics work beautifully because the underlying dispositions of consciousness are regular and law-like.
So the equations are correct descriptions of the pattern of appearances, but not necessarily descriptions of a deeper, non-conscious, mind-independent reality.
Precisely. The success of physics doesn't prove the existence of an observer-independent material world. It demonstrates the profound consistency and mathematical structure inherent in the way consciousness manifests and interacts with itself.
And the causal power, where does that reside? Not in particles hitting particles.
In the anti-realist view, the ultimate causal power resides in the dispositional nature of the conscious subjects themselves. It's the inherent power of subject A to elicit a certain experiential pattern in subject B. What we interpret as physical causation, like billiard balls colliding, is actually the surface appearance of these deeper consciousness-based dispositional interactions. The causal engine is mind, and the physical world is the predictable structure of its self-interaction. ###HowChurchA. So, to wrap up this deep dive, we saw panpsychism emerge as a really compelling alternative, aiming to fix the big problems with dualism, its causal impotence due to causal exclusion and materialism, its explanatory failure with the hard problem. It proposed consciousness as the fundamental, intrinsic nature of all reality.
A very elegant idea. But as we explored, this elegance seems to shatter if panpsychism holds on to the common sense, realist assumption that the physical world exists independently out there in space, the worm in the apple.
Right. That realist commitment immediately generated two huge problems of its own. The combination problem, how do private subjects merge without violating privacy? And the inner-outer gap problem, how does inner experience mysteriously transform into outer independent structure? These problems essentially mirrored the failures of the theories panpsychism sought to replace.
Which led us to the conclusion that the only apparent way for panpsychism to remain coherent is to fully embrace anti-realism, to let go of the observer-independent world and understand physical structures as patterns of cognoscensory imagery within consciousness itself, grounded in the dispositional powers of subjects to appear to one another.
This anti-realist move successfully avoids the combination and inner-outer gaps. However, it leaves us with a remaining, perhaps even deeper, explanatory challenge. Understanding why conscious subjects have these specific, stable, law-like dispositions to appear to each other in the consistent ways described by science. What grounds the order?
It's really striking how this entire complex philosophical landscape seems to pivot on one single, often invisible, metaphysical assumption about whether reality is fundamentally out there or fundamentally experiential. It really shows how our background picture of the world shapes the very problems we encounter.
It absolutely does, and it leaves us with a final thought, something for you to ponder. If the physical world, with all its apparent solidity and laws, is ultimately just the structured way that conscious subjects are disposed to appear to one another, does that imply that the most fundamental layer of reality we can ever truly grasp isn't the isolated object, but rather the relationship, the interaction, the shared appearance between conscious perspectives?